Hello and welcome to another video. So once again, I'm diving into a past game and I'm going to talk a little bit about the design of it, both the actual sort of game design and the technical design, the structure there. I'll also be making a bunch of the code for this available, much like with the other projects. So let's dive on in. So this was again a game that was created with that pool of 24 hours available for spending on it. And so this one was nearing the end of that series of ones I was doing. So by this point I had a sort of bit of a solid structure. So you'll notice like the later ones, there's a very consistent layout for things like the main menu. There is consistent setup for things like settings screens, how all of that stuff works, because I started creating more reusable components. And that was one of the big benefits from doing this series, was it let me put together a lot of reusable sections that I could use in other projects, which meant I could, when starting a new project, focus on the game rather than on infrastructure stuff. And this is part of why I really recommend doing things like building a lot of small projects, because you can, as well as learning a lot, getting familiar with that process of finishing things, you can start to build up a really good base of systems and tech and tools that let you just then focus on making the game. So let's take a look first at what the actual game is. So this one was a post-apocalyptic sort of setting. So you've become trapped in this bunker and you wake up in there. And very intentionally, the first thing you see when you're in there is this sort of markings on the wall of indicating what days have actually passed. And if we look around, we've got sort of food. We have things like a shower and a toilet. Now, from a level design point of view, you'll notice these I can't actually see out. That was intentional, was so that I could avoid needing to have a skybox and worry about trying to make that change appropriately. I just wanted to have the lighting coming through with giving you really very limited information about the external world. You've got these planter pots that can grow food, and you have this water purifier, but can see that the water purifier, the intake is blocked. So what happens with this game is there is no way to win it. You can survive for as long as possible, and that's really sort of the goal, is surviving for as long as you can. So each day there's particular tasks that you can do, like telling it to purify water, like getting here and watering these plants. But each thing that you do, like of this, that actually consumes resources. So that consumes water. So I'll actually have less water available here. And when I go and drink water, I'm obviously drinking the filtered water. But so there is some resource balancing that you're doing here that can really affect how long you're actually able to work with stuff. We've got this terminal that we can make use of, so we can actually use the terminal. And this is something where you can actually type in stuff. So I can view my journal, and then I can say, okay, I want to view journal 1. So we've got different things like of that we can do. And later journals are actually procedural. So I can tell it to do a radio scan, and this will actually look for sort of emergency signals. And while it's doing that, I can't do anything else on it. I can go to sleep once it's sort of dark enough. I can eat food. And the different things that I do and the different things that happen actually affect those journal entries. and different amounts of time pass. So with this, it wasn't just a single day that passed, multiple days passed. And that's also an intentional thing. I wanted to mess with the passage of time there, because if it was a very strict, okay, a consistent linear amount of time passes every time, it was not going to work quite as well. Like, I wanted this feeling of time being kind of slippery, and it's sort of skipping beats and things like of that. That also makes it possible for me to do things like, and we'll be able to see once that's charged, I can put in, battery levels. I can put in journal entries for days that were not actually, you didn't sort of actively play through them. So it can fill in the blanks, as it were. So each day I can kind of do a bunch of these things. Amounts of the water, because multiple days will have passed, amounts will get used here. And we can kind of see, the intake is blocked. So eventually it's going to run out of unfiltered water. So eventually you're going to run out of water. You're eventually going to run out of food. There is no limit to how much food you can eat. You obviously can take a shower, but that's going to expend purified water. Using the toilet doesn't add to the unfiltered water, and same with using the shower. And I think if there was stuff I was going to change, that would be one thing that I would modify going back to it, is that I would actually go and have those actually add to the water a bit. So if I look now at the journal, I've got more entries. So I can look at journal 4, and it has stuff about the planting, has stuff about the radio scans, because I did a radio scan. So these journals are actually procedurally generated. And they're procedurally generated based upon events that have happened, events that you've done. So it makes a distinction between I chose not to drink water and I didn't drink water because there was none available. So it's kind of, I quite like how that actually works. So I could do another radio scan, but as someone who built the game, I know that it won't make a difference. And we can see time-wise, so we're at the 7th now. If I go to sleep, then when I wake up, a variable amount of time will have passed. So in this case, 3 further days have passed. So I'll actually notice food will disappear from here without me having done anything, because days have passed, so I consume a certain amount of food. The plants here, I can begin watering them. I do believe there are actually plant models that will eventually grow, but from memory, it's intentionally too late by the time you actually have them. Because as I said, there's no way of winning this, as it were. It's a case of the best you can hope for, and can see, the unfiltered water level has dropped massively. And I believe if this was charged enough, I'd be able to see a journal entry indicating that there might have been a leak, because there actually is water leaking. So even if you don't essentially spend any water on things like the plants, you will inevitably run out of it. So yeah, it was kind of intended to be this very sort of isolated experience with this sense of time being slippery, and also having, these attempts to be able to try and contact the outside world. So like, I can check the radio status. So I can see that I've scanned multiple ones. I can tell it to do another one, but if I do that, I can't do check journals or entry, anything like of that. So it's really just something where the computer is fully devoted to that. Now, if we look, we've got 3 cans on the middle shelf, and we've got 3, 6, 8 on the lower shelf. I go to sleep. Now, I haven't gone and eaten anything. And less cans on the middle shelf, less cans on the lower shelf. And if you try and stay awake, it actually won't allow you to. After a certain point of time, it does force you to actually fall asleep. That was, again, I wanted to have this sort of experience where that sort of control and everything is being taken away. So we can see unfiltered water level is now down to 0. So now what we've got is what we've got. And so that really makes it a big sort of limitation with it. So now that we've looked at the design side of this, let's take a look more at the code side of it. So there's a few sort of, I think, key systems here that are interesting and that I'll make sort of parts of it available for. So this journal system is, I think, one of the big ones, and this is one of the things where I mentioned where these are procedurally generated to an extent. So if we take a look at the different journals, we have core content here, but then it has these optional things that can be put in for if we could not or did not do something. So making that distinction between I made a choice not to and I had no choice but not to. So you don't see a lot of those early on, and the first few days, because those are fixed, we don't actually see any of those. But afterwards, we do start to see ones. So we'll see things like, okay, if we didn't water the plants, that's portrayed as forgot to water them. And these get added in. You can see here's the little tag points where it gets inserted. So this allows me to construct the journals based upon these different events that have happened. And as we step through, we'll encounter ones where there's more stuff that might get added in there. Later ones, it reaches the point where you just can't actually do any sort of watering of them, and the journals get shorter. Again, that's an intentional thing. I didn't make as much use of this as I wish I had. So I think things like the eating didn't get made use of. It didn't end up fitting in. Same with the sleep exhaustion. This also, I did have limited time with this, with the budget I was sticking to. So there was more that it could have done that I wasn't doing. But in terms of how this worked, it wasn't super complex. So the journals were scriptable objects, had the usual sort of stuff we'd expect for configuring the data. And then what it would do is it would get these events. It would turn those events into keywords based upon those particular types and store those. So that would populate this keywords dictionary that would get returned. So nulls would know, okay, there was nothing, but if there wasn't a null, then it would go and look for the token. And then this is where it would process those. So these daily events, if it found a keyword, and the keyword, the actual sort of value for it was not null, then it would go and just do a simple string replace. So very straightforward for what it would need to do for that. And it would do a little bit of splitting and reformatting just to actually make it so that if there wasn't an entry for something, it didn't leave weird blocks of empty space. So I just split it and rejoined it afterwards. So it would split, trim, and then reconstruct. So just kept it that the formatting looked consistent. The journal manager itself, so it would keep track of what ones were visible. It would get told when it was the next day and would retrieve the journals based upon that. And then with these ones, if you tried to tell it, to get a journal that didn't exist, it would just give you back an error message. So that worked fairly well. That allowed it to keep track of ones. The actual events, these got kept track of here with this register daily event. So F the player, the game manager, I had handle a lot of stuff, can see by the length of it. From a code design point of view, I think that is something where I would have done that differently, and I would have split more of that out, because there's a lot of stuff that's essentially not really the game management side, but is kind of more narrative management and experience. So I think I would have split that out. I put too much stuff into the game manager, so it maintains stuff like those food stacks, it maintains stuff like the emergency radio scans, all of that stuff goes here. So when I go and do one of those things, it adds in an entry in this all events. And then I don't really do much with that beyond the journal. And that's again something where I think I had intended to do more with it. And we can even see, if we go down to the main method that runs when the day gets advanced, I had planned to do something with those events, but I never ended up actually doing that. So that's something where I would have done that a little bit differently next time. I would have made it that I was actually doing something more interesting with it than just the journals. I would have fleshed that out. So I think that aspect of the design didn't have the depth that I wanted it to. It did, I handled all of the events. So all the events do actually get triggered. I just don't actually do as much with them as I could have. We do, it scans amount of frequencies, all of this stuff gets updated. Again, the radio scanning doesn't actually do anything. It's a thing you can do that locks out the computer, but nothing actually happens from it. And I think this is one where I'm actually okay with that being the case. Because I think that's something where I would have, I don't think there was anything there that I could have done that would have been great. Maybe I could have chucked in some more custom messages in terms of, if you've scanned with the radio, of adding things into the journal, of maybe at times hearing things towards the end. I think that would have been a good addition. So I think the design side, I could have done more with that. And obviously, there was the intent to, but I didn't. So we would tell the water source to consume filtered water that we'd figured out we consumed. So there was a forced amount of water consumption based on the amount of days that advanced. Same thing happened with food. The frequency blocks, all of those would progress. Now the updating, that didn't end up being really used for anything. And we'd clear out the events once it was done. So this handled a lot of stuff, but there was a lot of things where it could have worked better, I think. As I said, the design side, I think, needed more depth to it. If we take a look at how things like the planters worked, so they were pretty straightforward. They manually added in the listeners for the on next day. Don't know why I did it manually rather than, I think this is something where it would have been better to actually link this up in the inspector. I was going for this approach. That's why you don't see it in the inspector, but you do see it linked up here. A lot of stuff for status, fairly straightforward. And again, this process for consuming water, the amount of hydration, so that would depend, affect sort of how much it actually used. I think, again, there's a lot of things that use water. So there's a lot of things that do this consuming of filtered water. Things like the shower, you'll see the same thing. And it has a consume water somewhere. So shower is in progress. So I might have done that. Oh no, yep, consume filtered water. The toilet did the same thing. So there's a lot of ones that, with the toilet at least, it would consume unfiltered water first and then consume filtered. So there's a lot of things like of this that were consumers of a resource. And again, this is something where I think if I was approaching this again, what I would have done is, because I've got a lot of things that need to do some very similar behavior. That's something where I would have had either an interface or a base class, maybe both depending upon the scenario, that is something that is able to consume water. So that I have consistent centralized behavior, so that stuff like of this where it can prioritize which water it uses, that's just there as a property on it. And just something that I configure in the inspector rather than being something that's handled directly in code as a special case for everything. Because there's basically a lot of the same logic is used in all of these, and that's not great. So I think definitely scope for improvement there with that. The water tank itself has quite a bit of logic to it, because this has obviously the consume filtered and unfiltered, has this filtration cycle that can be active. So there's quite a lot that it's doing. It has the stage that it can be at. So it can be doing the purifier update stage, and if it's doing that, then we go through, indicates the appropriate daily events. There was the leaking amount that would happen, so both tanks had leaks, and then we would update the amount of water that we had. So it worked quite nicely, this sort of setup, but it did mean that it was very sort of manual for a lot of stuff. Again, I think a better setup could have resulted in it being significantly improved. Now with the plants, if we go and take a look at those, so those would be fittings. So we've got our planters here. And I'm trying to remember if I actually even had a model. No, that's right. Because they never end up managing to grow in time, because you always end up running out of water, you never actually see a model. And I think that's something where that could have been done better. I think going forward, with that, what I would have done is actually have the beginnings of something, because you see water spraying when you activate the sprinkler system. So there is feedback there in terms of, yes, water is being applied, and there is text feedback saying that the plants are growing. But there's no visual feedback of actually seeing the plant there. And I think it might have raised the stakes and influenced how people played if you actually saw these plants start growing, and if you saw them, wither if you don't water them. So I think there was scope for doing more there than I actually did. So I think design-wise, that would have improved things quite a bit. Again, it's all about sort of crafting that experience, and I think that would have added to the experience as well. For the computer itself, that had this battery, and the battery would only charge during daytime. So it couldn't charge at night, because idea was that it was solar powered. And it had some custom stuff there for playing various sound events, and it had some custom commands. that you could run. So there was stuff for the journals. So this is using my console component. I modified it slightly to be able to use it as an in-game one. So again, had different stuff for the radio. So that is all there, and I'll include that in the code as well. So all these things did work quite nicely. I did also, much like I started doing in a lot of these later projects, I made a lot of use of timeline. That made things a lot easier. So for doing stuff like all of the camera transitions, all of the fading in and out, all of that was done via timelines, because that made it work a lot better. Stuff like the food stacks as well, those were their own separate thing. So they were on the shelves, I believe. And so they had spawn points for these different cans and everything. So the cans would get spawned in, and I think the game manager handled the actual, that's right, it had the food stack script, which didn't really do a lot. This was a very lazy way of doing this. But it handled, consuming food, and it would pick random ones from that list that wasn't always disappearing from the same shelf. And they were just generic food. So overall, there was a lot of interesting tech, like the managing the resource consumption side there. This was the first time I'd done something like that. And I think it worked well enough, but I think making it more generic and thinking about stuff more in terms of the concept of, sources and sinks, I think would have allowed for less code and a bit more of a flexible setup. And I think if I'd had that, I might have been able to have more time to do things like with the journals, because like showed, these journals really didn't have a lot of stuff to them. It didn't, I had this system for doing a lot of variation for having these intricate procedural journals, but it didn't end up getting fully put to use because I didn't implement a lot of the events. And I think narratively it doesn't work too badly, but I think it could have worked better, and I think there was missed opportunities with that. So stuff in terms of player feedback, in terms of bringing people more into the world, I think would have been, a better way of doing stuff. I think I also would have added in additional interactions that someone can do during a day. So there are these skylights, and I think allowing people to try and be getting out there and maybe showing indications, because there are journal entries talking about having tried to get out of the skylight. I think, if then that day when you woke up and there was that journal entry for that, things like shattered glass on the ground and this being shattered maybe, or, seeing like a ladder or something like of that propped up to try and be getting through. So I think there were further things that I could have done there that wouldn't have taken a lot of time. Again, 24-hour constraint, there was a limit, but I think with some better design of some of the systems, like the water handling, stuff like of that, I think with that, they would have given me a few more hours that would have allowed me time to then spend it on things like expanding those journal entries and more changes around the actual sort of bunker. Because it becomes very clear that you're not going to actually survive this. So ramping up the stakes and giving people a reason to feel like they might just survive it, I think is important. And I don't think it pushed things as strongly towards building that sense of, hey, I might just make it through this, as it could have. So yeah, layering in those additional elements, I think would have improved the design there a lot and improved sort of the impact of it. But I'll make this code, a bunch of the code available. Like with any of the code that I share, that code is something you can use in your own projects. It's not going to be the full code for the project because there are bits of middleware that I can't include because I don't have the license for distributing those. But for all of the bits that are my own code, I will include those. So one of the things that will be in there will be a lot of audio hooks for WYs. Those obviously aren't going to work, but the code, if you want to use it, or parts of it in your own projects, then by all means, you're very welcome to do that without any restrictions, just like with the rest of the code. Thanks, folks. Hope you found the video interesting and helpful. If you have, check and like and subscribe. It really helps out. It's really appreciated. If you're looking for the code for some of the snippets that I showed off, that is available up on GitHub, and there is a link to that in the description below. If you have got any questions, then chuck those in a comment. If there are other ones like this you'd like to see me talk about, then please do chuck those in a comment, unless it's one of the large commercial games I've worked on, because that I cannot show the code for or talk through any of those bits, unfortunately. But for all of my indie games, ones like that, I absolutely can. And if you are looking for other ways to support the channel, then I do have a Patreon, and there is a link to that in the description below. But until next time, bye!